In the rugged mountains north of Madrid there sits a palace that looks extra like a fort than a home. It is referred to as El Escorial. It is a big square of gray granite rising from the dry earth like a tombstone. It has heaps of home windows, however they allow in very little mild. The corridors are cold and silent. In the middle of the stone labyrinth sits a small bedroom. It is Spartan and simple with naked walls and a hard bed. From this tiny room a person ruled the world. His name turned into Philip II of Spain, and he turned into the maximum effective man or woman at the face of the earth. He managed Spain and Portugal. He managed the Netherlands and large parts of Italy. He controlled the Philippines and the spice routes of Asia. And most importantly, he managed the Americas. From the silver mines of Mexico to the mountains of Peru, the wealth of the new international flowed into his arms. He became the master of the first empire on which the sun by no means set. To his enemies, he was a monster. The English known as him the demon of the South. The Dutch called him a tyrant. However, to his bankers, he became something even worse. He became the world's worst borrower. And we regularly think of records as a sport of generals and kings. We think of battles and treaties. But the story of Philip II is a tale about cash. It is a story approximately the illusion of wealth. It is the tale of a person who earned extra gold and silver than any monarch in records, and yet some way managed to die completely broke. It is the story of a king who went bankrupt, not as soon as, now not twice, however 9 instances. And in doing so, he destroyed the financial system of Europe and set the degree for the decline of the Spanish Empire. To apprehend how the richest guy within the global misplaced everything, we have to look at what he inherited. Philip became born into the House of Habsburg. This became the dynasty that had married its manner to worldwide dominance. His father turned into the Emperor Charles V, a man who spent his complete life preventing wars against the French, the Ottomans, and the Protestants. Charles became a warrior king. He changed into continually on horseback, transferring from one battlefield to the next. But wars cost cash, massive amounts of cash. Charles paid for his wars by way of borrowing. He borrowed from the excellent banking households of Germany, specifically the Fuggers of Augsburg. When Charles abdicated the throne in 1556, he turned into an exhausted and broken man. He retreated to a monastery to die, leaving the empire to his son Philip. But he left Philip something else too. He left him a mountain of debt. When Philip placed the crown on his head, the Spanish crown already owed millions of ducats to the bankers. The hobby bills alone have been ingesting up the bulk of the royal income. Philip did now not inherit a fortune, he inherited a mortgage. But Philip was constructive. He had something his father did no longer have. He had posé. In the excessive Andes of modern Bolivia, the Spanish had discovered a mountain made of silver. It became the largest strike of valuable metallic in human history. The indigenous human beings had been enslaved and forced to paintings within the mines. They died by way of the hundreds to pull the silver from the rock. This silver turned into melted down into bars stamped with the royal seal and loaded onto galleons. Once in 12 months, the treasure fleet might sail from the Caribbean to Seville. When the fleet arrived, the docks might groan beneath the burden of the bullion. It turned into a river of silver flowing directly into Philip's pocket. Philip believed that this river could never run dry. He believed that God turned into on his side, and that the silver become a divine present to help him defend the Catholic religion. This perception became his fatal flaw. Because he notioned his profits was limitless, he spent money as if there had been no tomorrow. He did not act like a person in debt. He acted like a man who had won the lottery. His first act as king became to preserve his father's struggle towards France. The French have been the traditional enemies of the Habsburgs. The warfare became brutal and pricey. Philip assembled a massive military in the Netherlands to attack France from the north. In 1557, his navy met the French at the Battle of St. Quentin. It was a wonderful victory for Spain. The French military turned into beaten. The street to Paris lay open. Philip changed into the grasp of Europe. But victory is high-priced. The squaddies had to be paid. The suppliers had to be paid, and the bankers who had lent the cash to raise the military were asking for their hobby. Philip checked out his treasury and observed it empty. The silver fleet from America had been delayed by using storms. The tax revenues from Castile had already been spent 3 years earlier. The king of the world was insolvent. In 1557, simply 1 year after taking the throne, Philip II declared the primary sovereign bankruptcy in modern history. It became a surprise that rang throughout Europe. He did no longer call it a bankruptcy of path. Kings do not pass bankrupt. He referred to it as a suspension of payments. He issued a decree pointing out that all the short time period loans he had taken from the bankers were now transformed into long time period bonds referred to as juros. This would possibly sound like a technicality, however it turned into a disaster for the bankers. The short-term loans, referred to as acentos, carried high hobby prices and had been alleged to be paid back fast. The bankers depended on that money flow to pay their personal depositors by changing them into long-term bonds. Philip turned into basically pronouncing, "I will now not pay you, return now. I will pay you again over the subsequent 50 years at a much decreased interest rate." The impact changed into devastating. The great banking residence of the Fuggers, which had financed the Habsburg upward thrust to energy, turned into crippled. They had lent hundreds of thousands to Charles and Philip, trusting in the word of the emperor. Now they held portions of paper that had been well worth a fraction of their face cost. Anton Fugger, the pinnacle of the circle of relatives, wrote despairing letters to his retailers. He found out that the Habsburgs had been a bottomless pit. The German banking dominance started out to vanish, changed by using a brand new group of sharks who notioned they had been smarter. The Genoese, the bankers from Genoa and Italy, were distinctive. They were tough, calculating, and less sentimental than the Germans. They checked out Philip's financial ruin and saw impossibility. They knew Philip wished money to keep his empire strolling. They knew he couldn't continue to exist without them. So they presented him new loans, but had even better hobby costs and with stricter conditions. They demanded control over the salt mines and the sales taxes of Spain as collateral. They essentially had become the repo-men of the empire. Philip ordinary their terms. He had no choice. He had wars to fight. The largest battle of his life changed into simply starting. In the northern part of his empire lay the Netherlands. These had been 17 wealthy provinces that had been the middle of change and industry in northern Europe. They had been additionally becoming an increasing number Protestant. Philip was devout Catholic. He believed that it became his sacred duty to stamp out heresy. He delivered the Inquisition to the Netherlands. He burned heretics at the stake. He stripped the nearby nobles of their electricity. The result changed into the Dutch Rebel. In 1566, the human beings of the Netherlands rose up. They smashed the statues of the saints in the Catholic Church buildings. They attacked the Spanish garrisons. Philip turned into furious. He decided to weigh down the rebellion with an iron fist. He dispatched his toughest well-known, the Duke of Alba, with a military of 10,000 veterans to Brussels. The Duke of Alba became a terrifying parent. He set up a tribunal called the Council of Blood. He carried out heaps of human beings, inclusive of the very best nobles of the land. He imposed a new tax known as the 10th penny, which demanded 10% of every transaction. The tax destroyed the Dutch financial system and united the people in opposition to Spain. The rebellion turned into a struggle, referred to as the 80 Years' Struggle. For Philip, this battle became an economic black hollow. The Netherlands had been hundreds of miles far away from Spain. To get infantrymen there, he had to march them along a direction referred to as the Spanish Avenue, which went from Italy over the Alps and up via Germany. Every step of the man a price cash. The squaddies wished meals. They wished boots. They needed powder. And they wished their wages. The Spanish squaddies have been the exceptional inside the world, but they have been mercenaries. They fought for pay, now not for patriotism. If the pay failed to arrive, they stopped fighting. And due to Philip's economic chaos, the pay hardly ever arrived on time. The history of the Dutch rebel is a record of mutinies. The Spanish army might win a wonderful conflict and then sit down and refuse to transport till the gold arrived. Meanwhile, within the Mediterranean, a brand new risk became growing. The Ottoman Empire became expanding westward. Their fleets were raiding the coasts of Italy and Spain. They had been taking pictures Christian ships and enslaving lots of human beings. Philip noticed himself because, the defender of Christendom, he had to construct an army to stop the Turks. Navies are even greater costly than armies. A galley ship requires loads of rowers who have to be fed every day. It requires wood, pitch, tar, and cannon. Philip poured millions of ducats into the shipyards of Barcelona and Naples. In 1571 he assembled a big fleet, called the Holy League. Under the command of his one half-brother, Don John of Austria, the fleet sailed to fulfill the Turks. They met on the Battle of Leonto. It changed into the most important naval war in records up to that point. Hundreds of ships smashed into every other. Tens of heaps of men died. The sea grew to become crimson with blood. Spain gained a crushing victory. The Ottoman fleet changed into destroyed. Philip turned into hailed as the hero of Europe. The Pope ordered bells to be rung in each church, but victory at Leonto did no longer convey money. It just added greater payments. The fleet had to be repaired. The sailor needed to be paid. And the Dutch were nonetheless rebelling. The fee of preventing wars straight away on two unique fronts was unsustainable. The silver from America changed into flowing in at report ranges. However, it became flowing out even quicker. Philip became spending the silver earlier than it even arrived in Seville. He became borrowing towards future fleets. He became essentially using a payday loan provider to run an empire. By 1575, the scenario was essential again. The Duke of Alba did not overwhelm the Dutch. Philip replaced him with a new commander, but he sent him without a cash. The debt had ballooned to not passable ranges, the Genoese bankers. In view that Philip changed into overextended, refused to lend any more coins. They closed their handbags. On September 1st, 1575, Philip declared his 2D financial ruin. He suspended bills to the bankers once more. He cancelled the licenses of the Genoese bankers, stopping them from doing business in Spain. He tried to bully them into giving him better terms. It became a high-stakes sport of chicken. Philip notioned he should force the bankers to bend, but he forgot that his army within the Netherlands became expecting their pay. The end result changed into one of the finest tragedies of the 16th century. The Spanish squaddies inside the Netherlands had no longer been paid. For months, they had been ravenous and indignant. When the information of the financial disaster arrived, they realized that no cash become coming. They snapped. They determined to pay themselves. In November 1576, the Spanish military marched on the town of Antwerp. Antwerp changed into the richest metropolis in northern Europe. It became the industrial capital of the arena, an area of splendor and subculture. The Spanish soldiers stormed the city. They burned the homes. They murdered the guys. They raped the girls. They tortured the merchants to discover wherein their gold become hidden. It changed into called the Spanish Fury. 7,000 residents of Antwerp have been massacred. The metropolis become reduced to a smoking ruin. The sack of Antwerp destroyed the commercial middle of the Netherlands and dispatched a wave of horror through Europe. It also destroyed any habit of Philip winning the hearts and minds of the Dutch people. Before the sack, there have been nevertheless Catholics in the Netherlands who supported the king. After the sack, all of us united against the Spanish monsters. The financial disaster of 1575 had priced Philip his reputation and his hold at the Netherlands. He finally reached a cope with the bankers, but the harm turned into completed. He had to agree to pay the infantrymen their returned wages. But to accomplish that, he had to take out even greater loans at even better hobby costs. The cycle of debt became tightening round his neck like a noose. You might suppose that when two catastrophic bankruptcies, Philip could learn his lesson. You could suppose he might reduce his spending, prevent his wars, and attempt to balance his books. But Philip turned into not a person who compromised. He became a man of absolute conviction. He believed that he was doing God's paintings and that God might offer. He viewed the bankruptcies now not as screw-ups of coverage, however as tests of his religion. So in preference to shrinking his targets, he expanded them. In 1580, the King of Portugal died without an inheritor. Philip became the closest relative. He saw a header to unite the whole Iberian Peninsula underneath one crown. He released an invasion of Portugal. It turned into a speedy and a hit campaign. He marched into Lisbon and crowned himself King of Portugal. This was the zenith of his energy. He now controlled the Portuguese Empire in addition to the Spanish Empire. He controlled the African coast, the buying and selling posts of India, and the spice islands of Indonesia. He managed Brazil. He became the grasp of the oceans, but with new territory got here new costs. The Portuguese Empire became crumbling and under assault by the Dutch and English. Philip now had to pay to defend colonies on the opposite side of the sector. He had doubled his belongings, but he had tripled his liabilities. And then there has been England. The English Queen Elizabeth I changed into a thorn in Philip's side. She became a Protestant heretic. She supported the Dutch rebels, sending them cash and soldiers, and she allowed her pirates men like Francis Drake to assault Philip's treasure fleets. Drake raided the Spanish coast and stole silver from the galleons. He was humiliating the best king on earth. Philip determined that he had to deal with England once and for all. He started out to plan the Company of England. We realize it as the Spanish Armada. It became to be the best invasion pressure ever assembled. A large fleet of 130 ships sporting 30,000 soldiers. They could sail up the English Channel hyperlink up with the Spanish Navy within the Netherlands and land in Kent. They would march on London, seize Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism to England. The fee of the Armada became astronomical. It required deforestation of complete regions of Spain to construct the ships. It required lots of cannons to be solid. It required lots of biscuit and salt pork to be baked and packed. Philip micromanaged each element. He sat in his small room in the escrow, counting the barrels of wine and the kilos of powder. He calculated the cost of every nail and each rope. To pay for it, he tired the treasury dry. He borrowed each penny he ought to from the Genoese. He begged the Pope for a subsidy. He squeezed the Spanish taxpayers till they bled. He wagered the complete house on this one roll of the cube. He believed it couldn't fail because it changed into a campaign. In 1588, the Armada set sail. It changed into an outstanding website, a floating city of castles. But from the moment it left port, matters went wrong. The food commenced to rot within the barrels because the wood became inexperienced. The water went horrific, and the English were waiting. The English ships had been smaller, however faster, and had better guns. They carewormed the Armada up the channel, then got here the hearth ships off Quetta. The Spanish formation broke. The fleet became scattered. And then the wind. The Protestant wind blew them north. The Armada changed into smashed in opposition to the rocks of Scotland and Ireland. Half the ships had been misplaced. Thousands of men drowned. The great organization became a total disaster. When the information reached Philip within the Escorial, he did no longer rage. He sincerely stared on the wall. He stated, "I sent my ships to combat in opposition to Guys, no longer in opposition to the winds and waves of God." But the bankers were no longer inquisitive about the winds of God. They wanted their cash. The Armada had priced 10 million ducats. It became money that Philip did not have. The lack of the ships was a financial catastrophe. The investment became at the bottom of the sea. As we stop the first part of the tale, we see Philip at a crossroads. He is getting old. He is sick with gout. His top-notch gamble is failed. His money odor mounting. The silver from America is still arriving, but it is not enough to plug the hollow. The bankers are circling like vultures. The empire is stretched to the breaking factor. But Philip does not prevent. He cannot prevent. He is trapped in a jail of his very own, making a prison built of gold and debt. In the subsequent component, we will see how the obsession with struggle drove him to intrude in France Main to the very last and maximum devastating fall apart. We will see how the influx of silver simply destroyed the Spanish financial system from inside, and we can witness the lonely demise of the person who owned the world but could not pay his bills. The failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588 were a wake-up call. It was a military and financial disaster that wore out a decade of sails. But for Philip II, it became merely a setback in his divine assignment. He believed that God turned in to try out his remedy. Instead of cutting his losses, he doubled down. He ordered the rebuilding of the fleet. He ordered new taxes at the peasants of Castile. He ordered his diplomats to locate new assets of credit score. The man changed into an addict, and his drug changed into imperial ambition. In the 1590s, Philip decided that would seal the fate of his price range. He determined to intrude within the French wars of religion. France was tearing itself aside in a civil conflict between Catholics and Protestants. The Protestant chief Henry of Navarre became prevailing. Philip changed into frightened of a Protestant king sitting on the throne of France proper next to his borders. He believed it would infect his own nation with heresy. So he ordered his army inside the Netherlands, which changed into already combating the Dutch to show south and invade France. This turned into strategic suicide. By diverting his troops, he gave the Dutch rebels a hazard to get better and retake territory. He became combating a conflict on two fronts with clear's throat assets slightly enough for one. And now he opened a third front. He sent cash and troops to the Catholic League in Paris. He successfully put the entire French Civil War on his payroll. The price changed into amazing. Spain turned into now buying an army in the Netherlands and navy inside the Atlantic and a proxy battle in France. The expenditure became 3 times the entire profits of the crown. To preserve the gadget jogging, Philip needed to resort to increasingly desperate monetary tricks. He commenced to debase the forex. For centuries, the Spanish foreign money was the envy of Europe. The silver real and the gold escu had been the standard with the aid of which all other cash become measured. But inner Spain, Philip added a new coin called villon. It changed into made from copper combined with a tiny quantity of silver. It became fiat money, junk currency used to pay local bills, while the real silver turned into dispatched abroad to pay the bankers and the armies. This triggered massive inflation within Spain. The price of bread skyrocketed. The poor had been pushed to the threshold of starvation. The middle magnificence became worn out. But Philip didn't care about the domestic economic system. He cared approximately the geopolitical game. He became playing chess on a continental scale. And the Spanish people were simply pawns to be sacrificed. The Genoese bankers who had changed the Germans were now the masters of Spain. They controlled the ports. They accumulated the taxes. They dictated the phrases. They knew Philip become insolvent. However, they saved lending him money due to the fact that the hobby charges had been so excessive that it became well worth the danger. They evolved a gadget called the Fies de Bzanchong, which were monetary galahs wherein they traded credit notes. They created a bubble of paper debt that floated above the Spanish financial system. But bubbles always burst. In 1596, the inevitable befell. The silver fleet from America became smaller than predicted. The wars in France have been dragging on without a victory in sight. The English sacked the metropolis of Cadiz, burning every other Spanish fleet inside the harbor. Philip reached into his treasury and located nothing not an unmarried ducat. On November 29, 1596, Philip declared his 0.33 financial ruin. It was the maximum devastating one, but this time he did not simply suspend bills. He decreed that the loans he'd taken from the bankers had been unlawful. He claimed that the bankers had charged his interest fees and consequently he had no ethical duty to pay them lower back. It changed into a surprising act of royal robbery. He seized the sales that had been pledged to the bankers. He confiscated the silver that belonged to personal merchants. He correctly nationalized the financial machine to shop his regime. The banking houses of Genoa shook to their foundations. Many went bust. The credit of Spain, which turned into already damaged, became now completely destroyed. No one in Europe could lend a penny to Philip without collateral that they may bodily maintain. The bankruptcy of 1596 marked the quit of the Spanish Golden Age. It paralyzed the navy. In the Netherlands, the Spanish troops over again mutinied for lack of pay. This time, the mutiny allowed the Dutch leader Maurice of Nassau to seize key towns. The Spanish dominance inside the north became broken for all time. In France, Henry of Navarre converted to Catholicism, famously saying, "Paris is properly really worth a mass," and united the United States in opposition to Spain. Philip's intervention had failed. He had spent thousands and thousands to forestall a Protestant King Bess to see that king convert and defeat him. Anyway, Philip, become now a vintage guy. He become dying. He spent his very last years within the escrow rotting in his bed. He suffered from terrible ulcers and gout. He changed into unsteady ache. As he lay dying, he looked at the debts of his kingdom. He noticed the damage he had prompted. He had inherited a debt of 20 million ducats. He was leaving a debt of 100 million ducats. He had taxed his topics into poverty. He had wasted the wealth of the Indies. He summoned his son, the Destiny Philip III, to his bedside. He advised him, "I supposed to leave you a rich state, but I leave you a bad one." It became a rare second of honesty. On September 13, 1598, Philip II died. He held a crucifix that had belonged to his father and handed away in the darkish stone room he had constructed. But the story of Philip's bankruptcies isn't always just a tale approximately one guy's bad selections. It is a story about a fundamental economic paradox. How ought to the proprietor of the silver mines be negative? How should the nation with the maximum cash have the worst financial system? Economists nowadays name this the resource curse, or the Dutch disease, although in this case it became the Spanish sickness. The inflow of silver from the Americas became supposed to make Spain rich. Instead, it destroyed Spain's industry. Because silver was so ample and Spain fees were high. This meant that Spanish goods like wool and fabric were luxurious in comparison to items from England or France. It became cheaper for a Spaniard to buy fabric made in London than fabric made in Toledo. So the silver failed to live in Spain. It flowed right through Spain. It went to English merchants, French producers, and Italian bankers. Spain became a funnel. They did the tough paintings of mining the silver and transporting it throughout the ocean. But the relaxation of Europe got to hold it. The Spanish economy became whole. They stopped making matters. They overlooked their agriculture. They relied absolutely at the treasure fleet, while England and the Dutch Republic had been building industries, developing joint inventory organizations, and growing banking structures. Spain became just spending cash. They had been like a lottery winner who buys fancy motors and huge homes, however does now not spend money on a commercial enterprise. When the cash stopped flowing, they had no profit supply to fall back on. The bankruptcies of Philip II in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596 were the milestones of this decline. Each one represented a failure to adapt. Each one ruined the credit score of the nation and forced the king to sign away greater of his sovereignty to foreign lenders. By the end of his reign, the tax sales of Spain became owned by means of foreigners before it was even accumulated. The legacy of those defaults became durable. It created a way of life in Spain where inefficient paintings turned into undervalued, and authorities' carrier or the church were visible as the simplest decent careers. The hidalgo, the minor noble, who owned nothing however his pleasure, and his sword became the image of the age. Doniot, written a few years later as the precise metaphor for Philip S. Spain. A delusional knight, fighting imaginary giants even as his real existence crumbles round him. Meanwhile, the bankers learned their lesson. The Fuggers and the Genoese had been ruined. However, the monetary center of Europe moved north. It moved to Amsterdam. The Dutch, who had fought Philip for 80 years, discovered from his mistakes. They constructed a device based on alternate, not plunder. They based the Bank of Amsterdam and the Dutch East India Company. They invented contemporary capitalism. The wealth that Philip had wasted changed and picked up through his enemies. The very last irony of Philip's life is the be aware, determined inside the cargo maintain of his ships. The visible photograph of a galleon arriving with an IU is not a long way from the truth. In the later years of his reign, the Silver Fleet was often completely mortgaged earlier than it even left Havana. The king would stand at the docks expecting the ships, praying they hadn't sunk, knowing that each bar of silver being unloaded already belonged to a person else. He became the CEO of the arena's biggest organization, and he could not make payroll. Philip II is a warning from history. He proves that money is not wealth. Silver and gold are just steel. True wealth comes from productiveness, from industry, and from a sound monetary machine. You can't triumph over the sector on credit score. You can't outspend your heirs. Even in case you very own the minds of Posse, even in case you rule the oceans, in the end the invoice comes due. And in case you cannot pay the repo, man comes for your empire. Spain would remain an incredible electricity for any other century, but the rot had set in. The subsequent kings of Spain would declare financial disaster over and over in 6,7,600 and 27,647. It had become an addiction. However, it became Philip the Prudent, the critical guy in black, who started out the cycle. He built the Escorial as a monument to God. However, he left it as a tombstone for the Spanish economy. The king, who went bankrupt 9 times, proved that in the sport of empires, the accountant is mightier than the general. This is John, and this is the Cinematics History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay beforehand of the curve due to the fact. While the history books are written, you will want to be some of the few who saw it.